Well, new this morning, there's a push now to create sanctioned heroin shoot-up rooms in the U.S., and one Maryland lawmaker is all part of this campaign. Dr. Dan Morham is a delegate for the 11th District, which covers part of Baltimore County. He and other lawmakers around the country want to set up these so-called shoot-up rooms to prevent people from dying of overdoses. At a sanctioned site, a doctor or nurse could give an overdose antidote if it needed. These rooms do face a lot of legal and political hurdles. You can follow the latest news on the fight against the heroin epidemic here in Maryland. Just go to abc2news.com/heroin.
What's going on? What's going on, y'all? Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Rell Talk, the podcast. I don't know if y'all been watching news lately, but there's a huge epidemic going on in the white community with heroin. Heroin is taking over these white communities up north, like in New Hampshire, in Boston, Cape Cod, even in the Midwest. A lot of these white affluent communities are being ravaged by heroin. And a lot of black scholars are just saying that it's funny how now that when the face of addiction is white and not brown or black, the media has a lot of sympathy for the addiction and those who are addicted. Now, before I did this podcast, I went through dozens and dozens of videos on dozens of news sites in different states, and I listened to the narrative of the people who are addicted and the enforcers, as in the police officers, and how they deal with these addictions and these drug addicts. Let's call it what it is, drug addicts. And the narrative is so different than what it was in the 70s and the 80s and in the 90s with African Americans. Now, I'm not playing a race card at all, but I would be a fool to not see the difference in the treatment of people who are not black when they're dealing with a social issue. Now, don't think for a second that I don't think these people need help. I'll let y'all hear some clips, and we'll talk after all of these clips about how the narrative is different.
We have to make more people aware of what an epidemic and what a crisis this opioid issue is. You can't look the other way. You've got to act immediately.
You hear that? Now, I can vividly remember in the 80s, reading articles, and I have friends who had parents who were addicted to crack and cocaine. And the solution for dealing with us was to throw us in jail. The users and the dealers. But now the narrative is totally different. I mean, just listen to how these news outlets talk about this new epidemic with heroin. I mean, it's almost like they're talking about, we thought these group of people were immune to social issues that affect other races of people.
America's heroin epidemic has become impossible to ignore. The numbers are staggering. Nearly 500,000 Americans say they used heroin in the past 30 days. Heroin overdoses more than tripled between 2010 and 2014, and deaths from all opioids, including heroin, are now approaching the number of deaths from car crashes.
What I'm not going to play because it's just a bunch of, let's not make, white America seem so evil and vile and, seem like they lack morals and values, which is why they're using these drugs. Let's say it's because of another reason. So what this guy is saying is that it's because of painkillers, that a lot of these people who are addicted to heroin were once addicted to some type of prescription painkiller. And that may be the truth, but they didn't give us any passes. You know what I mean? We were coming off of 400 years of slavery and oppression and Jim Crow. That within itself is a mental illness, and nobody allowed us to use that as an excuse. And, there are certain sites, there's certain articles that I read up on, and I'm going to read y'all some of the things that they were saying about the new numbers. So there was 47,000 American overdoses in 2014. 60% of those were heroin or painkiller related. Now, I'm not going to front. That's a lot of deaths. That's a lot of overdoses. You know what I mean? And again, people should be helped. I mean, you know what I mean? But some experts and researchers see, you know what I'm saying, that there's a different response in these drug epidemics. You know what I mean? Further proof that, America has a huge racial divide and nobody wants to deal with that. I mean, the president and all of these candidates are now talking about this epidemic of heroin and drug use and how we need to get people help, and prison isn't the answer. Everybody's talking about this now, and again, I totally agree that criminalizing these people is not the answer. But I'll say this for the second time: the African American community is in the situation we're in partially because of the destruction that was put on us in the late 70s and early 80s. These candidates are in their 50s and 60s, so they were politicians during the 80s, especially during the 90s. My question is, where were they? Where were they when African Americans were being criminalized for their addictions?
Today, we're also announcing some new actions. First, we're ensuring that federal agencies train federal health care providers who prescribe opioids. This is a common sense idea that you're already implementing here in West Virginia. Congress should follow that lead and make this a national priority, and we look forward to working with governors and the medical community as well.
It started in the earliest days of this campaign. The very first question was, what will you do about the heroin epidemic?
So that's why I so firmly believe in the way to really win the war on drugs is to treat the addict.
For those whose lives we have a chance to save, I want us to try to save those lives.
If somebody has a drug problem, and far too many do, you got an illness. Treat it as an illness, not as a criminal problem.
Addiction needs to be, it's a lifetime challenge, and you need to have a recovering kind of philosophy about this, and people need to stay together in this regard. And look, I have some personal experience in this just as a dad, and it is the most heartbreaking thing in the world to have to go through.
My husband Frank and I buried a child to drug addiction. So we must invest more in the treatment of drugs.
Kudos again to all these people who want your vote to be now talking about addiction when the people who are addicted looks like them. I'm gonna tell you straight up, I don't think they should have these shoot up rooms. Okay, I don't. I think that's stupid, and the idea behind these shoot up rooms, if you don't know, is they are going to have these centers where these people can come shoot up with clean needles, and they're going to be doctors on staff to pretty much be there in case they overdose. So the advocates are saying, if they're going to use, let's have them use in a safe environment so they don't spread disease and so they don't OD somewhere in the dark alley. People who are not for this are like, but they're still using drugs. You got to get them off the drugs. And I totally agree. Whatever kind of treatment they had before this, they need to do that on a widespread scale. I don't think you should administer heroin injections or allow these people to do drugs in your presence just because you don't want them to OD and because you have somebody there just in case they overdose. I think that's counterproductive. But as I said before, let's touch on the cocaine epidemic in the 80s and the crack epidemic in the 80s that tore through the black community and came through and tore up lives like a thief in the night. Let's talk about that, because I really want you to understand that I'm not just talking. Okay, this was a real thing that happened to millions and millions of African Americans in the major cities in the South and in the North and the Midwest and on the West Coast. I personally have friends who, when I was born in 85, I personally had friends who parents were either addicted to crack or was in jail because, again, they arrested the users and the dealers, or who was dealing cocaine or crack. So they were affected by this all around. And so before I go any further, I'm going to play y'all some clips of proof that the CIA put these drugs in African American community to purposely tear the African American community apart. And it worked.
A super secret organization like the CIA is going to have secrets, but this sounded too bizarre to be true. Yet there it was, in print, in a respected newspaper. The accusation that the crack epidemic, which ravaged this country's cities, was spread with help from a secret army linked to the CIA.
Now, I know people are listening that's saying, here's more conspiracy theory. But this is proven. Because as y'all know, someone who worked in the Nixon White House recently came out a few months ago and said that that was a plan. I mean, before we just only thought it was a plan, but he literally verified that that was a plan. He confirmed it, that was the plan the whole time. You could infiltrate the so-called African-American leaders by putting drugs in the neighborhoods. That'll give the CIA and the FBI reason to raid their houses and their homes and completely shut down any organization or any type of good they were going to do, or anything they were planning to stop the brutality and the discrimination of African Americans. I mean, look up Fred Hampton. Look up Fred Hampton. This brother was young. Ran up in it. This brother was young. They ran up in his apartment in Philadelphia, I think, and killed him in cold blood. But the media and the papers will have you think that this brother was a terrorist, that this brother meant nothing but trouble, and this brother was for his people. And they went in and they straight took this brother out. I'm telling y'all. But listen to this brother, Gary Webb. He worked for the San Jose Mercury News, and he was the one that dropped the dime on the CIA. And just so y'all know, this brother supposedly committed suicide.
Men who were working for the CIA's army were responsible for bringing all that cocaine into Los Angeles that sparked the crack epidemic.
That was Gary Webb. He worked for a local newspaper, and he interviewed people on the low who admitted to what was going on. And when the CIA found out that he had classified information, they told him, do not go public with this or all kind of things are going to happen. And he still went public with it, and his life was ruined. If they feel as though you got something on them, they'll take you out, which is why most people don't talk about what the CIA is up to, what they've done. They just kind of leave it alone. But as I said before, everybody knows. Here is then Senator John Kerry talking about what the government did and what they owe to our communities.
South Central Los Angeles and every other city in America are owed an explanation. People knew that drug trafficking was getting mixed up in the flow of weapons. People knew there were bad types involved in this operation. They didn't turn off the spigot. That's plain and simple.
You see what I'm saying? You see what I'm saying? So I hope by now y'all understand that I'm not just talking, that I'm telling y'all the response is totally different when you talk about the heroin epidemic that's going on now in 2016 versus the crack and cocaine epidemic that was happening in the 1980s. It's viewed differently by the public. Everybody is so sympathetic about all of these white middle-class Americans who are having this addiction issue. I was watching a video earlier where they were in Cape Cod and they were talking about these, I'm assuming they were mid-20s, they were talking about during the summertime, their town's population doubles. So there's so much to do around the town, but during the wintertime and the school year, everybody leaves town because they're not vacationing there anymore. So the people that live there have nothing to do. So most of them, out of boredom, turns to prescription painkillers or heroin or alcohol or weed. Now, I can tell you straight up, these white suburban kids were saying, I've been smoking weed since I was 13. I was drinking alcohol since I was 12. And I thought everybody was doing it because I was doing it. I can tell you right now, that's what they think about these young kids in the ghetto. They think we smoke and drink at a young age like that. But clearly, white suburban kids are doing it, but they're viewed differently. You should have seen this interview. It was put together so nice. I mean, they were sitting in a nice suburban living room, pictures on the wall, and these kids were talking, and you never really got the connotation that you were talking to little ghetto kids. It was like, look at these kids, they're suffering, and they're suffering in silence, and they need help. They're crying for help, and their town needs help. And I'm like, take that same camera crew to Chicago and let a young boy on the street tell you in Chicago that he smokes weed and he's 13. The media will tear that young boy's parents a new rear end. They will talk about how the city of Chicago has failed this young man, and his parents in this community has no morals and no values, and they let these kids run rampant, and that's why the violence is the way it is in these communities. But as you can see, the same thing happens in suburban America, but society sees it different. And for those of you that say it was the 80s, what happened to African Americans? It was the 80s. So what? 30 years ago, get over it. But listen to Freeway Ricky Ross talk about what it did and what it's currently doing to the African American community.
Destroyed our community. All the black men are in prison, most of us. The women are still strung on the drugs, kids without fathers, without mothers.
On your best day, how much money did you see?
Couple million, 2, 3 maybe.
To anybody that doesn't feel the same sympathy for the African American community that you do for these middle class or upper class or even poor Caucasians who are suffering from a devastating epidemic and addiction that's going on in their communities, shame on you. Because I'm telling you, watching these stories, watching these videos of what's happening in these, I watched the video of these 2 young kids. I mean, had to been, maybe 13 to 14, maybe a little younger, but they talked about how they watched their mom shoot up, how they watched their mom use heroin. And she's clean now, but they were just telling her what they saw, and she was like very emotional because she was out of mind at the time, obviously, and she didn't realize that they were seeing what she was doing. And I'm gonna be honest, that broke my heart, you know what I mean? Because I'm saying, imagine the thousands and thousands of young black kids that witnessed their mom shoot up, witnessed their mom, tying the elastic around her arms so she can shoot up, watching their dad get carried away by the police, or watching their brother or uncle get carried away by police, watching their siblings get taken from their parents because of an addiction, siblings being split up by the system because their parents were addicted to crack. Imagine watching your sibling be taken to another place separate from you in the blink of an eye because your mother or your father was addicted to crack. This is what happened to our community. We didn't have the luxury of living in a suburban neighborhood where the media converged on our problem and said, we have to do something. They dealt with us in the criminal system. They're dealing with them in with a pacifier. Let us help you. We don't want to lock you up. We want to help you. And that's great. I applaud society for now handling addictions the right way. But I don't and I won't forget the way society handled the addiction of African Americans. They treated us like we were immoral, low values, just some animals who didn't want better for ourselves. That's why we were suffering what we were suffering. 30 years later, you have kids who were raised by their grandparents. The Oxford Journals wrote an article about the physical and emotional health of grandmothers raising grandchildren in the crack cocaine epidemic. You have children right now, or adults right now between the ages of 25 and 40 who dealt with a parent addicted to crack or a parent who was incarcerated. You have brothers right now who during that time were incarcerated and given a life sentence. You see, that whole scheme setup is what created the super predator Hillary Clinton was talking about. That's why I don't give her a pass. Never will. That's tough. I'm not going to front. That's tough, to really see what they did to our community and how the average white American will tell you right now to get over it. All those years of slavery, rape, kidnap, torture, just to go through the Jim Crow South where they said we couldn't drink out of the same water fountain as them. We couldn't go to the same restaurants. Our kids couldn't learn with their kids. To all of a sudden gain equality through the civil rights movement, to only be devastated again even more with addiction. You want to talk about the people who struggled, who've been through a lot? Hats off to anybody who's black and making it in this world. Because obstacles aren't even the word. An obstacle is something that you can get over. We've literally had to dig ourselves through brick walls where there wasn't no going over or around. You had to go through it. No other race of people have the obstacles that we face in our lives, but still we rise. We've always been through tough struggles and trials and tribulations throughout our history in this country from the very beginning. Just embrace who you are, but never forget your past and never forget who did it to you. That's all for today, y'all. Thank y'all for tuning in. I really enjoyed chopping it up with y'all. Until next time, Rell Talk, the podcast.